Choice, your creative superpower. We have the power to manifest as we dedicate attention to our thoughts, but often miss opportunity to achieve the greatest good. Your superpower is waiting to be unleashed to unlock a fuller, more rewarding world for all. Join us every Thursday at noon Mountain Time for Choice, your creative superpower with Zoe Muro. And now, here's Zoe.
Hello, folks. Welcome to the New Thought Media Network, and welcome to Choice, your creative superpower. My name is Zoe Muro, and I am once again absolutely delighted to be your host. If you're coming back, it's good to have you here. If this is your first time, well, welcome. We're here each Thursday at 11 a.m. Pacific Time, 12 noon Mountain Time, to explore how you can use the awesome superpower of choice to co-create the greatest good in your life experience. I'm a religious science practitioner and transformational coach. I work with people who are looking to live their lives to the fullest. Today, in episode 33, we'll be looking at choice and vulnerability. I've actually been somewhat hesitant to get into this topic. It can be kind of convoluted, and it can actually be polarizing for some. But it is definitely well worth examining. You might even say that I was feeling vulnerable about talking about vulnerability. So what does vulnerability mean? Well, the simplest definitions say that to be vulnerable means to be capable of being physically, financially, or emotionally wounded or endangered, to be open to attack or damage in some way, shape, or form. From my perspective, there's a very big difference between talking about physical or financial vulnerability and talking about emotional vulnerability. It's a choice at times as to whether you place yourself in a situation that would leave you vulnerable physically or financially. I mean, you might go rock climbing, or you might decide you're going to invest in the market. But then again, there are many times we have no choice whatsoever. You could get mugged, you can get laid off. One way we can look at choice relative to this is in your response. That is, how do you choose to respond? So if you were mugged, and we certainly hope that you would not be, but if you were, you can become fearful. You can become so fearful that you would choose to become a recluse. Or you could decide, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to study self-defense. Or you might say, I need to move to a safer place. Likewise, if you were laid off, you might choose to downsize, cash in an account that you had as an emergency fund, move in with family or friends. Now, I'm not suggesting that these types of vulnerability, physical and financial, are unimportant, but they do definitely tie into other aspects of choice that we've discussed extensively, such as identity, choosing our stories, regret, et cetera, et cetera. To the extent that how you are affected by the vulnerability being exploited will likely determine a number of choices going forward. So, in other words, when we see something like a physical or financial vulnerability, we might actually take actions because we feel that, because we sense that. And what we want to do, in essence, is to either reduce or eliminate that vulnerability. So, for example, financially, You might ensure that you have savings. That's the word I want. You might have savings set aside to cover an unexpected loss of income. Or you might delay a large purchase. You might seek additional income. You might ensure that your household budget is accurate and well thought out. On the physical side, you might avoid high crime areas or ensure that you're being vigilant and aware. You might travel with companions. Now, I don't want to make this all horrifying and frightening. Let's look at a different, significantly less frightening side of physical vulnerability. Okay. Talking about your own physical health. So there are choices that you might make there dealing with physical vulnerabilities. And the way you do that is you ensure that whatever training that you're doing, physical training, it's sufficient for whatever physical activity you engage in. So if, for example, you play ball, you want to make sure that you're strengthening yourself the way you need to. You want to make sure that you are stretching the way you need to. You want to make sure that you eat a wholesome, well-balanced diet. If you're going to run or you're going to hike, let's say out on the trails, well, you want to know what the terrain is. You want to know what the weather is. You want to make sure that other people know where you're going to be. These are all strategies to minimize or mitigate risk. These are all choices which you have made, which are influenced by or informed by your perceived vulnerability. I want to be clear here. I'm not using the word perceived in a judgmental or negative way, but it does lead to an important distinction in this discussion of vulnerability. Before I go there, I just want to see what we have here. Oh, and there's Fiona. Hello, Fiona. Good to have you. Okay, so I want to talk about emotional vulnerability. Okay, and I think that's really where we're going to be putting the emphasis for the majority of what we talk about here. Now, if you've read Brené Brown, and I sincerely hope you have, if you've read her, you know that she states very simply and emphatically that vulnerability is not a disadvantage. Despite how counterintuitive that may seem, it's like, well, vulnerability, wait a minute, how is that not a disadvantage? I want to read this one quote from her. Here we go. Vulnerability is not weakness, and the uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure we face every day are not optional. Our only choice is a question of engagement. Now, you know I'm going to come back to that line. Our willingness to own and engage with our vulnerability determines the depth of our courage and the clarity of our purpose. The level to which we protect ourselves from being vulnerable is a measure of our fear and disconnection. Very interesting. And so when we look at this quote, talking about financial, we're not talking about vulnerabilities. Let me start by saying that I believe Brené Brown is absolutely brilliant. I find her work and her writing to be exceptional. But I do have a different way of looking at some of these things. I'm shocking, isn't it? I have a different way of looking at it. Oh my God. First of all, I could not agree more that uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure are indeed part and parcel of our life. Absolutely. I honestly can't imagine that on this earthly plane, it could be otherwise. We never know what's coming around the corner. We just don't. And that lack of certainty, that lack of knowledge, is indeed an emotional vulnerability. Now, I'm not saying that any of those necessarily result in something damaging, the uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure, but rather I'm saying that the possibility is certainly there. Now, I do want to disagree with one thing that she said. She says that our only choice is a question of engagement. Specifically, I want to question this or challenge this from my perspective, because I believe that what one person sees as a vulnerability can be seen by another person simply as being open, as openness. I'll give you an example. What I'm trying to get to here. I was in a class a number of years ago, and we were doing a real significant deep dive on our lives. We were asked to look very closely at different stages of our life and consider the impact that different situations and different circumstances brought about for us. We were then given an opportunity, if we chose to accept it, to talk about those things, to talk about how they impacted us, to talk about their effects on our lives. I shared, well, actually, I don't remember exactly what it was that I shared, but whatever it was important for me at that time. It was personal. And I do remember, well, I don't remember the specifics of what it was that I said. I do remember the reactions of the people in my class. The other members of the class, all of whom were women, for if that's important or not, I don't know. But I do think that because I was the only man in class, that they did view what I was saying and how I was saying it as being unusual in some way. And they all praised me for my vulnerability. And they used that specific word. They said, "Oh, it was amazing that you could be so vulnerable." But here's the thing. I didn't feel I was being vulnerable. I was speaking of my life. I was speaking of my circumstances, my emotions, and how it all affected me. That is true. It was absolutely personal, deeply personal. But I did not feel that I was in any way endangered or open to attack or what have you. Here I was. I was in a class with a group of people whom I knew, at least to a certain degree. And we were examining these deep aspects of our life. And I was speaking my truth. I was being open. I did not anticipate, nor was I concerned about being hurt by anyone in that class. Was it necessarily something that I would just say to anybody that walked by? No. But I saw no reason not to speak out in this class. I did find it quite interesting, though, to see that person after person were so supportive of my being vulnerable. And my response to that, quite honestly, was to wonder if I had incorrectly assumed that I was safe. I started to question whether these people were truly safe to be around. But then I thought about this. I thought, in this instance, this wasn't about me. This was about them. It was about their feelings of safety and vulnerability. In other words, they saw a person speaking so openly about something that was so intimate that for them, they would find that to be a situation of vulnerability, that they did feel that that was putting themselves in some sort of danger in some way. Now, let's take the exact same situation, speaking openly about my personal life. Let's put it in a different setting with different people. And I absolutely could see that I would be struggling with my concerns. So, was it about them? Was it about me? I've come to the conclusion it was about both. So, this got me to think about vulnerability. What is it really about? And I believe that it is rooted quite deeply in judgment. Think about it. Assuming we're talking about emotional vulnerability, okay? Just emotional vulnerability. What is at the heart of the concern? I believe, in essence, it's about being judged and the consequences of that judgment. This is why people will try so hard to present themselves in a certain light, to be seen a certain way. They feel that they'll be accepted and even favored. Fiona, you say, speaking your truth is true authenticity. Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you are not speaking your truth, you could be in a situation where you're being inauthentic. But it does depend upon many different factors. For example, whether or not it's something that you feel a vulnerability around. So I don't think it's being inauthentic to protect yourself. But whether that authenticity actually carries forward into who and whose you truly are, that's a question now. Okay, let's see. So why do people want to see themselves or present themselves in a particular light? Why do they want to be seen a certain way? Well, to feel accepted and sometimes even favored. There's a fear of rejection, a fear of being less than, not good enough, not attractive enough, not intelligent enough, whatever it might be, on and on and on. Where this gets really interesting is that you have to consider there's a possibility of judgment on both sides of emotional vulnerability. What I mean is, there's obviously the person who's concerned that they might be seen as being undesirable in some way, or that there's something wrong, some negativity. But isn't the person who has that concern, in essence, judging other people? So going back to the class setting I spoke of, I could have decided that my classmates would be critical of me if I spoke my truth. And if I thought that, if I felt that way, then I definitely would have turned what was actually my openness into vulnerability instead. You can take this even further and say that if you don't value someone, you don't value their opinion, you don't value their station in life, if you will, that they just feel unimportant in some way. And this could be something as benign as this is someone you don't know at all and they don't know you, or it could be someone who has just been absolutely horrible towards you and made you feel that you were the worst person in the world. You probably would feel vulnerable around someone like that. I'm sorry, wait, I'm doing the reverse. Yeah. If this is someone that you did not respect, that you did not have this connection with in some way, shape, or form, did not feel that there was an import, in essence, you would have discounted them. So it becomes really interesting to see how vulnerabilities can change. Now, I speak very openly and very freely about my addiction, my abuse, my physical ailments, being estranged from my son. So much of my life is an open book. But that doesn't mean I have no vulnerabilities, that I have no fears, that I have no judgments of my own. I do. One of my huge vulnerabilities, to use that word, is speaking up in a group setting when I am the one and only person who sees things differently. I'd go through a process that seems like kind of like a threat assessment. It goes like this. It's like, oh man, I really disagree with what's being said. Have I really considered that they could be right and I'm just not seeing it? Okay, so let's assume they're right. Can I also be right? At this point in the process, I have to choose. I choose to speak up or to stay quiet or ask for more information. Now, over the years, I have been working on this over years, it's true. I've matured. And as I became clearer and more confident about myself, I realized that my choices were actually based on a number of factors. So, for example, was this really of enough importance to me to pursue it? I'm talking about the situation where I was the outlier in the conversation. Would I be willing to accept it that it could be nothing more than my expressing my opinion or perspective, but it's not going to change anything? Right? Just putting it into the mix. And was there really a downside, a danger, if you will, to my speaking up? All right. The last question there is the one that's most important for me in this discussion. And I think it's really the key to understanding emotional vulnerability, determining whether or not there is truly a possible negative outcome, and considering what the effect of that outcome might be. Now, I'm specifically saying negative outcome because if we were talking about a positive outcome, we wouldn't be talking about vulnerability at all. Nobody ever said, oh man, I feel so vulnerable to something good happening to me. No, that's called I am open to it. So now I want to dig into the real factors that affect our perception of vulnerability, in my opinion. Who, what, when, where, and why. They're not listed in order of importance necessarily, but I think that order of importance can actually speak volumes. But let's get into what I'm talking about here. The who part. Who is going to see, hear, or read what you might have to say, what you might be bringing out there? Are strangers, your boss, your significant other? Put simply, what is your relationship to the other party? And what is your level of trust with that other party? Okay. So take the exact same comment, the exact same revelation, if you will, the exact same way of expressing yourself or what it is that you want to express. Who it's being expressed to can make a huge difference. What? Are you presenting an opinion? Are you stating what you believe to be relevant facts? Is your pronouncement going to be something that's challenging? Is it going to be informative? Is it going to be disturbing? All those factors can determine whether or not you feel vulnerable. When? Speaking up during a planning or a strategy session, to talk about possible issues will be received far differently than the exact same issues being brought up after the thing's already been rolled out. All right. Very simple example of that one. Your friends get together and they say, hey, we're going to go for Indian food tonight. And everything's great, everything's terrific. As you get to the restaurant, you say, you know, I really don't like Indian food. They're like, well, why did you say that before? So timing is important. It's always important, probably in everything. That brings us to where. There's a big difference in what you say or do in your own home versus someone else's home, versus the workplace, versus a public forum. And that leads me to why. Why is this important to you? Why would it be important to others? And most importantly, why do you see a potential threat? Okay. Now, we could probably spend hours and hours and hours looking at different scenarios to give examples from each of these, but that's for you to work on, should you choose to do so. Because I think it really will help you to understand significantly what goes on in terms of vulnerability for you. Now, I want to take a different direction here for a moment. I've been speaking about vulnerability from one's own perspective. That is to say, how we would see ourselves as being vulnerable. But there is another side to vulnerability, and it's extremely important, and that is being aware of other people's vulnerabilities as best we can. When I did my episodes on addiction and abuse, for example, while I personally did not feel vulnerable in any way talking about either of these life-changing aspects of my own life, I did have to consider how my viewers might respond. Not whether or not they'd think poorly of me, but rather it was my concern for their own emotional safety, their vulnerability. Because I know for an absolute fact that many addicts and many people who have suffered abuse can be triggered. So I built in cautions and I advised people to take care of themselves. And I have to say, it was gratifying to hear from people who were indeed triggered by the discussions, but they were able to work through the material and actually reached out to thank me for presenting the topics. And there's a great consideration there. I saw a risk, a vulnerability, but rather than letting it stop me, I mitigated the risk instead. Now, I feel like this discussion of vulnerability could probably go on for hours, if not days. It's that pervasive an issue for so many of us. But my intent today for this episode was to get you to think about how vulnerability affects your choices and vice versa. When you get right down to it, vulnerability is about fear and judgment. The more you dig into, the more you explore and examine and understand your fears and your judgments, the more vulnerability falls away completely, or is mitigated, or is seen as simply being openness, being safe, being confident, being aware. These are all tools that can address many of the things that we perceive as vulnerabilities without endangering ourselves, without limiting ourselves. You know, I did a quick internet search. I was curious to see how many books I could find on personal vulnerability. All right, personal or emotional vulnerability, however you want to phrase it. I stopped counting when I got over 400. My intent today was not to question the processes or perspectives that these many brilliant authors have put out there, but rather to encourage you to examine your own processes, your own perspectives. Because the more that we can remove limitations in our life, the fuller, more precious, more exquisite our life experience becomes. As Brene Brown said, the level to which we protect ourselves from being vulnerable is a measure of our fear and disconnection. So I just said the same thing from the opposite side. Well, that fuller, more precious, more exquisite life experience, that's what I hold in my heart for you. That's it for today's episode. But I would invite you to email me at zodemuro@gmail.com. Let's get this one up there. There we go. If you'd like to have an opportunity to come onto the show and have a conversation about any of the topics relating to choice, or maybe you have a topic that you'd like to suggest that I would cover, I want to thank you for spending this time with me this week. And I encourage you to go to ntmedia.org. Check out all that there is there. There's over 40 hours of programming each week with more to come. And there's music, prayer, meditation, information, discussion. It's from a worldwide team that offers an incredible array of experiences and topics. For example, today at 12 noon Pacific time, that would be 1 p.m. Mountain time, I invite you to check out Finding the Joy in the Journey with the brilliant Reverend Gina Calvario-Krupka and her special guest, your doula for grief, my dear friend and prayer partner, Bonnie Gonzalez. And while you're exploring the New Thought Media Network, if you can, please go to ntmedia.org/donate. Help us bring all of this goodness to the largest possible audience as we work to make this a world that works for everyone. I look forward to seeing you again next week. Until we meet again, choose wisely. Much love and many blessings. Namaste.
Choice, your creative superpower. We have the power to manifest as we dedicate attention to our thoughts, but often miss opportunity to achieve the greatest good. Your superpower is waiting to be unleashed to unlock a fuller, more rewarding world for all. Join us every Thursday at noon Mountain Time for Choice, your creative superpower with Zoe DeMuro.